just give you a general overview of some of the themes of the book, which is about the past and nature conservation. And then I was going to talk a bit more about the spirituality element of it specifically, which is really like focus. It kind of, culture runs through the whole book, but one chapter is specifically on spirituality. So I was gonna do that. But first, I just wanted to share a soundscape. It's not a recording. It's a reconstruction of the wildwood as it would have sounded 6,000 years ago. So when the Britain's forests were at their wildest and loudest and most raucous. I created this alongside an ecologist in my day job as the editor of Inkcap Journal. We were working on a long feature about the changing landscapes of Britain. And this guy, Joseph Monkhouse, used archaeological records to recreate this soundscape. So it's obviously not a recording because it's based on 6,000 years ago, but it's as accurate a portrayal as you'll get of the wildwood. I'm going to attempt to share my screen now so you can see that and hear it, most importantly. Hopefully is that shown up?
Yep.
You can see a forest, right? I'll make it play. Cool. Great. So this isn't a picture of the wildwood, but it's the Białowieża forest in Poland, which is probably the closest approximation today. And I'll play the soundscape now. It should last for about a minute and a half if it's going to play. Okay. So yeah, I wanted to share that because I think it's really important when we think about these past landscapes that we get a more visceral sense than we can get from, just reading academic papers or something. I mean, you're all talking interestingly there about imagination. And I think imagination is a really important part of how we think about what landscapes could be and what they've become compared to the wildness that they had in the past. So in that clip, you might have been able to make out the sounds of aurochs, for example, which are extinct now, wild boar, which we don't have throughout much of the country, storks, crane, eagle owl, woodpeckers, goldcrest and hawfinch. Like I said, some of those go completely extinct and others are no longer present in Britain, while others are just rarities now. So you're not going to hear most of them in a woodland today. But also I think just as notable as the absences of certain sounds. So you won't hear any roads or aeroplanes or invasive species like parakeets. I think it's because of this imaginative element that the wildwood is a place that's always kind of captivated me. It was a place that was dark and fearsome and mysterious, a place governed by both life and death, where the landscape was constantly shifting in response to natural forces. So as well as sounding completely different to the woodlands of the modern day, it would also have looked completely different. There would have been giant trees felled by lightnings or storms rotting across the floor. These would have provided habitats for beetles and fungi. Beavers would have created wetlands by damming rivers and There would have been wolves and bears hidden among the trees. The hunter-gatherers would have mostly kept the edges of these landscapes. They were dark and scary, and they would have congregated around lakes and rivers, for example. But these were the last humans that would have known the wildwood in its full magnificence, because soon after that, that recording, farmers would have arrived in Britain, and they started to cut down the forests to make way for livestock and crops. So the wildwood is just one example of an ecosystem that's been lost to time thanks to us. But it's not all of the it doesn't represent the totality of ecosystems we've lost. I wrote Nature's Ghost because I wanted to know what the natural world looked like when it was still wild. And what surprised me most when I was doing that research is just how early the human-inflicted damage began. Even 125,000 years ago, there's evidence that Neanderthals, not Homo sapiens, actual Neanderthals, were shaping the environments in which they lived, using fire to attract big game to their camps. Humans began driving the megafauna extinct around 50,000 years ago through overhunting. Then the intensification of agriculture began almost as soon as it started. And ecologists have shown actually that the impacts of even ancient Roman farms, small scale organic, persist in present day forests. They're still changing the flora. So, the natural world hasn't recovered even when you think it might. So these changes brought about by our ancestors are dramatic, and they were often irreversible, but they were nothing compared to the havoc that we're wreaking today. Throughout history, wildness persisted alongside civilization in a way that it can't today, because humans then were, they were willing to still allow nature to continue at the edges of their worlds, or you could argue they hadn't developed the technology to prevent it doing so. So you still had a lot of the flora, the wild animals that you just don't see in modern landscape. But when I was writing my book, I didn't want to tell just a depressing story of a vanished world that we can't get back. Instead, I wanted to show how that historical information can be useful in how we conserve nature today, and how we can bring some of that back. Whether it's possible to revive something of our lost ecosystems, even if we can't bring them back in their full glory, and whether, as modern humans, we can coexist with nature in that way once again that we did in the past. The history is surprisingly controversial when it comes to nature conservation, though. The idea of looking back in time is seen as, it's dangerously romantic, and advocates of rewilding in particular are often quite quick to dismiss it as though there was something inherently subversive about attempting to undo some of the damage that we've done. Rewilding is often branded as simply wilding. They take away the re. You might have seen Isabella Tree's book. That's just wilding, and that kind of highlights how the emphasis tends to be on the future now, on letting nature take the reins rather than restoring the planet to any kind of historical baseline. And there are good reasons for that. It's impossible to rewind nature to a pre-human or even a historical state. Like, the world has changed a lot. We can't bring back the creatures that we've pushed to extinction. We can't send home the animals that we've brought over from other places. There's not even any room anymore for all the habitats and animals that would have existed during the days of our ancestors, back when the human population was numbering in the thousands rather than the millions in Britain. There are more demands on our land and water than there ever have been before. And then there are the impacts of climate change to reckon with. We can't just recreate the primeval world. We've got all these different forces acting on the environment now. But as we spiral into this unknown future, there are still lessons we can learn from the past, even if we don't seek to totally create it. History can teach us how to farm better, how to adapt to rising temperatures, and how we ourselves might learn to live within a slightly wilder world. And so I wanted to just share a few of the lessons I learned while researching my book with you now. So first, by looking back in time, we can see how ecosystems functioned before humans started farming and killing and building all over them. People, I think, often think this is common sense, that you can look at how nature behaves today and extrapolate from that how it behaved thousands of years ago. But that's actually not the case. The rules have changed thanks to humans. Take, for instance, the original landscape of Europe. What did that look like? It's quite easy to assume it would have been forest. Today, if you leave a patch of land to its own devices, it's generally forest that will spring up. Look at any abandoned garden, for instance, it turns to scrub and then forest. But evidence suggests that actually thousands of years ago, this wasn't the case. The difference between then and now is the presence of the megafauna, the mammoths and the woolly rhinos and so on. these massive creatures sculpted the environments in which they lived. They trampled vegetation, they knocked down trees, they were eating all the time, they were pooing. If you've ever seen a video of an African elephant taking down a tree, you'll start to get the picture. So what emerged then was not a dense forest, but a scrubby parkland type landscape. You could argue that was the natural baseline of Europe, not the wildwood. There was a paper published last year on this topic and it included some amazing illustrations of what that might have looked like. And I want to try and share that again with you now. Let me see if I can pull that up. I've lost my PowerPoint. Again, yeah, just because I want to be able to provide that visual cue. Sorry, I'm not very good at this.
No problem.
Pardon? Is it?
I said it's no problem.
I'm not very good at. Here we go. Right, I've managed to get it up now. So, that I think it's loading now. So
that's it.
Yes, there we go. So that's the first of the illustrations. That's fallow deer you can see there, which obviously we do still have, but not in landscapes like this. And next is you've got the straight-tusked elephants wandering through a kind of savanna-like landscape with some scattered trees. There you've got the aurochs in the kind of light woodland. And finally, that's an extinct breed of rhinoceros there. That's the paper it's from, if anyone wants to follow up on that. I can share that afterwards if anyone's interested. So you can see in each case that there's some kind of large herbivore in each. There are trees, but there are no dense forests of the kind that you might imagine. It wasn't until humans had driven these herbivores extinct that the wildwood I was just talking about could finally emerge, which raises an interesting question today about the restoration of the European landscape. Do we try to restore that closed canopy forest or that more open, scrubby landscape? What do we take as our model? Is it the start of the Holocene, or do we go back even further to Pleistocene when those megafauna were still around? And those decisions we make are not just relevant for rewilding, they're relevant for rewilding for obvious reasons, but farming too. Some of the best approximations we have today of this very ancient wood pasture landscape are low intensity farming systems where animals like cattle fill in for the lost aurochs. So say that's really the first lesson. You can look back to kind of fill in some of those lost jigsaw pieces and see how nature worked in its more pristine state. The second lesson is that the natural world contains a level of abundance and diversity that today might just seem impossible to us, and we can't even imagine it. Conservationists talk of shifting baseline syndrome, which is the idea that we measure losses against the baselines of our own childhood. Our childhoods were less diverse than our grandparents' childhoods, which were less diverse than their grandparents' childhoods, and so on. So memories are lost and memory shifts over time. But actually, natural history runs much deeper than human memory. By looking into historical archives, we can start to recalibrate our expectations of what the natural world should actually be like and what it should contain. Many of us, for instance, now celebrate the return of red kites to our skies. You might have seen them with their forked tails soaring over wherever you live. But have you ever had your hat stolen by one? Probably not. But this kind of interaction was common in the 16th century, as described by one letter in 1555. I want to read you an extract from that letter now. We have excellent kites in England. I have never seen any others of such size. Ours are much bigger than the German ones, and noisier, with big white patches, and more greedy. In fact, such is the daring of our kites that they often dare to take bread from children, fish from women, and cloths from hedges and from the hands of men. Indeed, very often they will take the hats from people's heads during the times they are nesting. The red kites we know today may be less bold, but at least we know they were always around. They were there in the 17th century. In some cases, though, humans have so thoroughly eradicated species from their old strongholds that we have literally forgotten they were there in the first place. In my book, I look at a few case studies where people have forgotten a species ever lived at all until close inspection of historical evidence suggested otherwise. So this was true of certain species of sharks off the reefs of the small island nation of Kiribati, which had been fished to oblivion. They're only, it was only discovered that these sharks ever existed when biologists at the Field Museum in Chicago were looking at old weapons made of shark teeth in their anthropology collections and discovered the teeth of these species among them, proving that actually they had been in the water. They'd been completely destroyed by the time that people started to write about them. That same kind of collective amnesia has been applied to white-tailed eagles in Wales too. It took the study of poetry from the Dark Ages, for instance, to discover evidence that for these people had assumed that actually they were never there, but the poetry suggests that they were there. And it's vital that ecologists uncover this kind of knowledge because of how reintroduction efforts tend to be governed today. Unless we can prove a species native, it's unlikely to be brought back. And worse, if those that make it back on their own steam might be treated as an invasive species and eradicated, as has been the case for beavers in certain parts of California. There was literally state policy to get rid of these beavers that were just returning to their old homes. People didn't realize this until they started looking for the evidence of it, looking at travel logs and stuff where people had spoken about the presence of beavers in these places. We can't rely on animals telling us these stories themselves, which is why conservationists must become historians as well if they're really serious about restoring a sense of the world as it once was. The third lesson that history teaches us is how we, as humans of the 21st century, can learn to coexist with wild nature again. I think there is a danger that the lives of our ancestors can be somewhat romanticized in this regard. We view them as, inherently in tune with nature and, wonderful spiritual beings. But I think it's important while we discuss this not to forget that it was actually our ancestors that killed off the megafauna and chopped down the wildwood in the first place. They weren't, they're not at all always something to aspire towards in every way. Meanwhile, like I was saying, we demand more of the planet now than before. There are more people demanding more food and more energy now than at any other point in history. So it wouldn't be practical of me to suggest that we all just become hunter-gatherers again, or even subsistence farmers, even though that might work for some people. We need to feed everyone. Still, I think it's important to consider what we can learn from the past. When I speak, probably the question I'm asked most is what we can do to help the planet today. And I think there are lots of, sensible stock answers to this. We can take fewer flights, we can eat less meat, insulate our houses, buy less stuff, that kind of thing. But since my book is about history, I want to try and give a history-centric answer to that question. And I think what most of us can do is reframe in a small way the role of nature in our own lives. So in the past, people would have had a much more intense relationship with the natural world. For our ancestors, it provided food, shelter, and medicine. It was something to be both revered and also feared. It wasn't just a positive relationship. Evolutionary biologists argue that these experiences have become embedded in our genes over time. As one pair put it, our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind. And this is why being in nature is often a calming experience for us, why it's good for our mental health. We evolved in those landscapes. But it's also why children from a very early age fear things like snakes and darkness more than they fear anything else, more than the end of the world, according to one study I looked at. It's only when we grow older that we learn to fear more modern things like school and guns and car accidents, these learned fears. These learned fears may serve us better in the modern world than our Stone Age fears. In fact, our Stone Age minds can sometimes lead us towards inappropriate and unhelpful behavior, like gorging on sugary food. Things like honey would have been scarce in prehistoric times, worth kind of filling up on when you found it. Or today, chocolate bars, they're widely available and best avoided if you can take the temptation. Still, I think we need to learn to lean into our Stone Age minds a little bit more and to welcome some wildness back into our minds. We need to protect nature because it's good for our bodies and our heads, but also because it's central to the experience of being human. And actually, that's not always an easy or a relaxing creature to be. Being deep in a forest, being outside in the dark, existing alongside wolves or bears, these aren't necessarily going to be pleasant experiences. I think I've got one friend who describes it as kind of type 2 fun. but they're intense and meaningful and memorable. They're the kind of experiences that live on in the stories we tell our own children as we travel through life. A few years ago, I had one of these kind of experiences myself. I was 5 months pregnant with my daughter, and I was hiking through the mountains of Italy with my husband. It was dusk, and it was dark. It was getting darker. We were a bit lost, and suddenly we found ourselves surrounded by all these wild boar, including a mother and her babies. And we completely freaked out. We didn't know where we were, didn't know how we were going to get back, and we were suddenly, there was scrub on enclosing us on either side, and we could see through it. Didn't know if there were going to be more, didn't know if they were going to be in our path, and we were completely on high alert. We were completely terrified, but it was also very exhilarating. I'd been moving quite slowly up till that point. I had a big bump, and suddenly I found myself capable of moving extremely quickly. I didn't know that my heart was able to beat quite that fast. It was scary, but it's an experience that I remember to this day, and that we often talk about. I don't know. I've learned a bit more about wild boar since then. I don't know if I'd be so scared now. Come around to them a bit, but it's definitely something I'm going to tell my little girl when she's a bit older, knows what a wild boar is. So I think if we want to live fully, we've got to embrace these kind of experiences too, and not be willing to settle for nature in the mild and tepid form that's offered to us today. That doesn't mean intentionally putting ourselves in danger's way. It just means learning to live alongside the wild, to adapt and respond to the behavior of certain animals. We've lost a lot of that knowledge, or figuring out how to safely navigate through treacherous terrain, to recalibrate our sense of where the real risks in this world lie. People, in the book I read about wild boar recently, was talking about how, people are killed so often by cows or by dogs or just by traffic, and wild boar aren't the real risk. So I think that's the third lesson that history teaches us, that for our own sake we need to demand more of everything, more diversity, more wildness, and that these things in turn lead us to experience more joy and more fear, even to a deeper and more profound experience of being human alive in this world. And I think that leads into the spirituality side of my book quite neatly. I think for some people this was an odd angle for me to include. I'm really quite a skeptical person in my nature, and a lot of people seem to comment on it either positively or negatively in reviews. The majority of the book is based on pretty hard science, the kind of things that you can find in peer-reviewed literature, and that was a bit of a safety blanket for me. I think if someone questions it, I can point out and be like, well, that very clever person said it and that other clever person agreed with them. But I think it's important for me to include the cultural elements of what we've lost too, and that involves the stories that humans have told throughout the past. It was hard to write because it meant I had to search into my own mind and find out what felt true to me, without at the same time disparaging what felt true to others, now and in the past. But I was sure that stories are important when it comes to nature and nature conservation. Whether they're old folk tales about witches or spirits, or beautiful verses by romantic poets, or even historical events that have happened in certain places, stories are foundational to how we see the landscape today, and ultimately to what we choose to protect. I do think that sometimes we misuse stories. Campaigners, I think, environmental campaigners know how much people love a story, and I've come across some instances where these colourful connections have been somewhat over-egged in order to reach a wider audience, for noble reasons. But I do think we have to be careful with the truth, especially when we're writers. I think one famous example is where Friends of the Earth were attempting to save a meadow in Oxford, where a road had been proposed to go through it, by suggesting it had been the inspiration for the checkerboard landscape in Alice in Wonderland. They bought it and they renamed it Alice's Meadow. But actually, there's not really any textual evidence to support that claim. I looked quite hard for it, and I spoke to one academic in Oxford, an expert in Louis Carroll, and she was like, if you look at any landscape in England, it looks like checkerboard. That's just the kind of landscape we have. And I also think that nature writers can be a bit overly keen on forging a spiritual connection to the landscape in a way that doesn't connect with a lot of readers. I think writers like to pretend sometimes they're on a bit of a higher plane when it comes to engaging with the natural world, and that can lead to reflections that sometimes don't ring true. And I think we have to be careful to write things that seem true. writers like everyone else, they live in a world of electric lights and social media and doing your big weekly shop at Sainsbury's. And I think it's hard to move authentically from this world into the kind of intense spiritual landscape that hunter-gatherers of the Mesolithic, for example, would have surely inhabited. It's, we face a different kind of landscape today. So I didn't want to be inauthentic or overly credulous when I was writing my book, while at the same time I did want to acknowledge the power that stories have held in the past when people did have that much more intense connection to the landscape, as well as the need we still have to connect with nature today in a symbolic and meaningful way. I don't think you can strip away all that power. I just think we need to be careful with it. And it turned out that the landscape around the Tanat Valley, which is what I talk about in my book, where I met up with Jack, was the perfect place to explore some of these tensions. I didn't really know that before I turned up there. So to give a brief overview of that part of the book, I explored the kind of rupture, the debate that took place in the local community when the local estate announced their plans to expand the pheasant shoot within the vicinity of the local church. Pheasant shooting is often controversial for environmental and social reasons, but here it caused a particular ruckus because it seems so at odds with the story of the myth behind the church itself, which involves around an Irish princess protecting a hare from a pack of dogs. And as a result, the surrounding area has been regarded as sanctuary for animals for a while. In the media, the focus tended to be on this part of the story, and you had even the Archbishop of Canterbury getting involved, but on the ground, the truth seemed to be a bit different. And I thought I'd read you a short extract from my book now where I could discuss my own experience of coming to that valley and digging into this story. Its conflict with the church, the Lechwedigarth estate, was unique. Yet the more time I spent in Llangynog hearing from locals about the saint's part in the controversy, the more complex the story became. Everyone remembered the mounting tension that followed the intensification of the shoot, a time of heated conversations, village meetings, threats of lawyers. Media attention had only served to inflame the situation further, and there was still a sense of nervousness around the whole affair, a fear of reigniting a controversy that had been more or less put to rest by the time of my visit. However, the sense I got from those I spoke to was that the uproar had never really been about the saint, but rather the usual objections to an industrial shooting estate. The people who left comments on one online petition more often objected to the disruption to the tranquility of the valley, or the endangerment of the history and heritage embodied in the church, than the threat to the concept of sanctuary itself. For those who did comment on the sacredness of the land, few seemed to come from a position of genuine belief. This is not entirely surprising. As far as I know, the residents of Llangynog are no more devout than those of any other village, while the pilgrims who visit the church, by definition, are those without personal connections to the land. People who, when the gunfire becomes too loud, can simply move on to some other saint's bones. It wasn't more controversial than anywhere else, but I think the people who are anti-shoot leapt onto the story of Melangeth as a hook to hang their own views on, one person told me as I hung around outside the church. Another suggested that the legend had been romanticised to protest the shoot. In other words, the saint seekers had been at it again. But the anti-shoot contingent weren't the only ones at it. Around a week after the country diary column appeared in The Guardian, an angry refutation was printed in the letters page, written by Christopher Graffius, representing the British Association for Shooting and Conservation. To pray for the aid of St. Melangeth for this nonsense is the real sacrilege, he wrote. Better to invoke St. Hubert, the patron saint of game shooting, to protect a well-run, law-abiding shoot that benefits the environment and the local area and produces good food. Graffius appeared unaware that Hubert himself had renounced the hunt after encountering a stag with a crucifix hovering between its antlers and hearing the voice of God inform him that he was headed to hell unless he changed his ways. In fact, there's nothing in the original account of Melangeth's life, composed around the 15th century, to suggest that the Tanat Valley was ever a refuge for animals. The Historia Divae Monacelle does tell of how Melangeth sheltered a hare from Brockwell's dogs, and that the prince created a sanctuary in her name as a result. That sanctuary, however, was originally intended for felons rather than animals, a legal practice recognised across medieval Europe. It was not wide-eyed hares, but thieves and murderers that could claim protection upon this sacred land. The historian Hugh Price suggests the retelling of the old legend could have been a form of saint-seeking in itself, an attempt by church laymen to reassert their judicial rights in the wake of the Edwardian conquest of Wales. Although for a time hares may have received some protection in the valley, parishioners did not extend their concern to the other creatures that shared it. Old maps show 2 cockpits, one in the churchyard and another just outside the gate, where birds were forced to fight to the death for the entertainment of onlookers. The spectacles were held in May, specifically to coincide with the feast day of the saint. People congregated from miles around to join the celebrations. The festivals, I'm told, last for a fortnight, wrote the antiquarian and folklorist Reverend Elias Owen. Perhaps in this context, the shooting of pheasants does not seem so out of place. Melangeth may have been known for her love of gentle creatures, but if any of them thought they could depend on her for safe passage through the valley, they were sadly mistaken. The saint's powers had always been patchy at best. Nowadays, they are weaker than ever. Without that deep sense of the sacred, the invocation of Melangeth had been useless in maintaining the safety of her sanctuary. Come the shooting season, the sound of gunshot would ring out across her once peaceful refuge, much as it always had. But I think so, that was my experience of going there and reporting on kind of religious element of that tale. But I think one of the reasons that the Tanat Valley was so interesting to me was that there was this other layer of story and magic written beneath that religious story, the older folk tales around giants and fairies and other magical creatures. That's kind of what I was discussing with Jack when we met up that morning in the conversation I include in the book. And I thought these stories were interesting because less is kind of made of them, of the religious story that, a lot of people visit as pilgrims, they go visit the church. But because less is made of these stories of giants and fairies, less is also demanded of them. They're simply part of the story of the valley that have emerged organically from the landscape over time, rather than being forced upon it by, princes and church scholars and ultimately environmental campaigners. And I think if those stories are losing their potency in the modern world, it's not because they cannot be proven empirically true, but because they no longer seem as true as the landscape that birthed them becomes less wild. And I think that gets at the heart of this chapter of my book for me. I think the problem is that we've become so disconnected from nature that we are no longer discovering and generating stories that hold true for us today. And so we tend to fall back sometimes on those that have gone a bit stale or a bit cold that we can't quite believe in. Which makes efforts to protect landscapes on that basis, a bit inauthentic. We need to and I think we need to start connecting with nature again, start restoring it to a wilder state so that we can start generating ourselves the kind of tales that seem vibrant and alive and true to us today. This kind of stories that we do believe in that have meaning, real meaning to us. And how we do that's always going to be a personal thing. It might be through sporadic encounters rather than a wholesale lifestyle change. I think that's more how it is for me personally, for the most part. But I think magic finds a way to sometimes, filter through the cracks in what is otherwise an ordinary modern lifestyle. You can see, I'm not living in a straw bale house or anything. I'm in a suburb of Durham. It's not like I've, completely rewilded myself. I thought that would be a good place to end. And